The January air bit sharply as Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt made her way up the granite steps of the Manchester Convention Centre. At 27, she had grown accustomed to being the youngest person in most political spaces, but her record of achievements spoke volumes louder than her age. The morning's frost had left delicate patterns on the building's windows, catching the early light as attendees filed in for the New Hampshire Political Forum, one of the Northeast's premier political gatherings. Inside, the warmth brought color to her cheeks as she navigated through clusters of attendees, many stopping to shake her hand or share quick words of support. Her press secretary, James Morton, walked 2 steps behind, quietly updating her on last-minute schedule changes and monitoring incoming messages on his tablet. "Congresswoman," James said, matching her brisk pace. "They've adjusted the panel lineup. Michael Barrett from Progressive Daily has been added as a last-minute replacement for Susan Chen. Apparently, she's down with the flu." Leavitt nodded, mentally noting the change. Barrett's reputation preceded him. 28 years at Progressive Daily, known for his particularly aggressive questioning style and what some called an old-school approach to political journalism. "Thanks, James. Any background I should know?" "He's written 3 pieces about you in the past year. None particularly favorable. The latest one questioned whether younger representatives were diluting the serious nature of congressional discourse." James's tone remained professional, but his slight frown betrayed his concern. "Well," Leavitt smiled, straightening her navy blazer, "let's give him something substantive to write about today." The main conference hall hummed with activity. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while technicians performed final sound checks. The morning's panel, "The Future of Conservative Politics, New Voices, New Directions," would be streaming live across multiple platforms. Leavitt recognized her fellow panelists: Governor William Hayes of Vermont, Dr. Rachel Martinez from the Conservative Policy Institute, and Senator Mark Thompson, all gathered near the stage. As she approached, she caught fragments of Barrett's voice from behind the staging area. "Shouldn't even be on this panel. What's next? Having TikTok influencers explain fiscal policy." His words, though not directed at her, carried clearly in the acoustic space. Leavitt chose that moment to step forward, extending her hand to Barrett. "Mr. Barrett, I'm Congresswoman Leavitt. I've followed your work for years. Your series on state legislature transparency in 2019 was particularly impressive." Barrett turned, seeming momentarily caught off guard by her direct approach and knowledge of his work. He shook her hand briefly, his grip notably loose, as if trying to minimize contact. "Congresswoman," he said, the title carrying a slight hint of mockery. "I trust you're prepared to discuss something more substantial than social media strategies today." Before she could respond, the panel moderator, veteran journalist Diana Chen, called them to take their seats. The stage lights warmed as they settled into their positions, Leavitt taking her place between Governor Hayes and Dr. Martinez. The audience of roughly 300 filled the hall, their faces expectant in the dim light beyond the stage. Diana Chen opened with a broad question about the evolution of conservative messaging, directing it first to Governor Hayes. The discussion flowed naturally, with each panelist building upon previous points, until Barrett interrupted Leavitt's response about digital outreach initiatives. "If I may," he cut in, not waiting for the moderator's acknowledgement. "Isn't this precisely the problem with modern politics? We're more concerned with Instagram followers than policy substance. Perhaps, sweetheart, you could tell us about actual legislative achievements instead of social media metrics." A subtle tension rippled through the audience. Diana Chen shifted in her seat, preparing to intervene, but Leavitt was already responding, her voice steady and clear. Thank you for the question, Mr. Barrett. I'd be happy to discuss my legislative record. In fact, the digital outreach strategies I was describing directly informed our district's infrastructure bill, H.R. 2741. By engaging with constituents through multiple platforms, we identified critical needs in our rural communities that weren't being addressed. This resulted in a bill that passed with bipartisan support, allocating $42 million to modernize our regional power grid and expand broadband access to underserved areas. The digital engagement metrics I referenced aren't just numbers. They represent real voices from our community contributing to tangible policy outcomes. She continued, maintaining eye contact with Barrett while referencing specific data points and policy implementations. The audience's attention was palpable, and even Barrett seemed momentarily thrown by the depth of her response. But he recovered quickly. That's all very well, dear. But wouldn't you agree that your, let's say, photogenic presence has played a role in your rapid political rise? Governor Hayes shifted uncomfortably, and Dr. Martinez's pen clicked sharply against her notepad. Diana Chen leaned forward. Mr. Barrett, let's keep our questions focused on policy. I appreciate your interest in factors contributing to political success, Mr. Barrett, Leavitt interjected smoothly. It's a complex topic that deserves thorough analysis. Would you be interested in exploring how various demographics overcome traditional barriers to political participation? I've actually co-authored a paper on this with the Conservative Policy Institute, examining how factors like age, gender, and background influence political representation across the spectrum. I'd be happy to share that data with you after the panel. Her response, delivered with unwavering professionalism, drew subtle nods from audience members. Barrett's attempt to diminish her had instead highlighted her expertise and composure. Throughout the remaining 40 minutes, she continued addressing each question with substantive answers, weaving together policy knowledge, constituent experiences, and concrete achievements. As the panel concluded, audience members rose for a standing ovation. Diana Chen thanked each participant, but her handshake with Leavitt lingered, accompanied by a knowing look of respect. In the front row, Sarah Chen, editor-in-chief of Progressive Daily, sat with her tablet, her expression thoughtful as she observed Barrett's retreat from the stage. James approached with Leavitt's schedule for the rest of the day, but she was already focused on the next challenge. The panel had been just one moment in an ongoing journey to prove that substance transcends superficial judgments. As she gathered her materials, she noticed Barrett lingering near the stage exit, his expression unreadable. The real test of character, she knew, often came after the cameras stopped rolling. "James," she said quietly, "let's make sure we have time to speak with everyone who's waiting. Every voice matters, especially those who might disagree with us." The morning's frost had melted from the windows, but the day's challenges were far from over. The wood-paneled hallways of the Manchester Convention Center buzzed with post-panel conversations as attendees dispersed for the lunch break. Karoline Leavitt walked alongside James Morton, reviewing notes for her afternoon meetings, when Michael Barrett's voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Congresswoman, a moment of your time?" Barrett's tone carried a false cheerfulness that made several nearby attendees turn their heads. He strode toward her, digital recorder in hand, his press badge swinging with each determined step. James Morton instinctively moved closer to Leavitt, but she gave him a subtle hand signal, the one they'd established for stand down, but stay close. She had handled aggressive journalists before, and something told her this confrontation needed to happen. "Of course, Mr. Barrett," Leavitt responded, turning to face him fully. "Though I hope you'll extend me the professional courtesy of using my title, just as I've extended that courtesy to you." Barrett's smile tightened. They stood in a wider section of the hallway, where the convention center's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of snow beginning to fall outside. A small crowd of conference attendees had slowed their pace, sensing the tension in the air. "Tell me, Congresswoman," Barrett emphasized the title with a hint of sarcasm, "how does someone barely old enough to rent a car presume to shape national policy? Isn't there something presumptuous about that?" Two security personnel stationed near the hall's entrance began moving in their direction, but Leavitt raised her hand slightly, signaling them to stay back. She noticed Sarah Chen, Barrett's editor-in-chief, emerging from the conference room, her attention drawn to the developing scene. "Mr. Barrett," Leavitt began, her voice steady and clear enough to carry to the growing audience, "I entered public service because I believe in the importance of diverse perspectives in government. My age gives me insight into issues affecting younger Americans, from student debt to startup regulations. But more importantly," she maintained direct eye contact with Barrett, "I've spent years working in both local and national politics, earning my position through hard work, just like every other member of Congress." Barrett stepped closer, his recorder thrust forward. "Come now, let's be honest here. You're a pretty face that the party can parade around to attract younger voters. How many serious policy proposals have you actually authored? Or do you spend more time on your Instagram aesthetic?" A murmur of disapproval rippled through the onlookers. James Morton's hand tightened on his tablet, but Leavitt remained composed, her posture relaxed but professional. "I appreciate your interest in my legislative record, Mr. Barrett. Let's discuss it in detail," she replied, opening her portfolio. "In my first term, I've authored or co-authored 17 bills, with 12 passing with bipartisan support. I can walk you through each one, starting with the Rural Technology Integration Act, which has brought high-speed internet to 47,000 previously underserved households in our district." She began pulling out specific documentation, her voice remaining measured and professional. "I'd be happy to share the impact assessments for each piece of legislation. The data speaks for itself. Employment numbers, infrastructure improvements, educational outcomes. These aren't Instagram posts, Mr. Barrett. They're tangible results affecting real people's lives." Barrett's face reddened slightly. "And I suppose your youth and appearance had nothing to do with your rapid rise? No advantages there?" A sharp intake of breath came from someone in the crowd. Sarah Chen had moved closer, her expression darkening as she watched her senior reporter. Leavitt took a deliberate pause, her next words carefully chosen. "Mr. Barrett, I've noticed a pattern in your questioning, both during the panel and now, that seems less focused on my policy positions and more on my personal characteristics. I wonder, have you asked male colleagues about their appearance's impact on their political careers? Or questioned the legitimacy of their service based on their age when they first entered politics?" The silence that followed was deafening. Barrett's recorder dipped slightly. "I'm always happy to engage in substantive policy discussions," Leavitt continued. "My office maintains an open-door policy for all journalists, including those who may disagree with my positions. But I believe we do a disservice to our profession, both yours and mine, when we reduce complex political discourse to superficial commentary." Sarah Chen had pulled out her phone, apparently recording the exchange. The security personnel had remained nearby but relaxed their stance, recognizing that Leavitt had the situation well in hand. Barrett's next words came out as a near sputter. "You're dodging the question. This kind of deflection." "Mr. Barrett," Leavitt interjected firmly but politely, "I haven't dodged anything. I've offered you specific policy details, legislative records, and impact data. I've also highlighted what appears to be a bias in your questioning approach. If you'd like to discuss any specific policy position or legislative initiative, I'm happy to do so. Otherwise, I have constituents waiting to meet with me about real issues affecting our district." The crowd had grown larger, and several people had their phones out, recording the exchange. Among them were other journalists, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and professional interest. Barrett seemed to finally register his surroundings, the disapproving faces, the recording devices, and most importantly, his editor's presence. His aggressive stance deflated slightly. "I think we're done here," he muttered, lowering his recorder. "My office will be happy to provide you with detailed briefings on any of the legislation we discussed," Leavitt offered, maintaining her professional demeanor. "James can get you those materials right now if you'd like." As Barrett retreated, visibly flustered, Sarah Chen remained, her expression unreadable as she watched her reporter's departing figure. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several attendees approached Leavitt to express their admiration for her handling of the situation. James stepped closer, speaking quietly. "That's going to be all over social media within the hour." Leavitt nodded, already refocusing on her schedule. "Make sure our response to any inquiries about this stays focused on policy, James. We're here to work, not to engage in personal disputes." As they walked toward her next meeting, the snow outside fell harder, coating Manchester in a clean, white blanket. Nature's way of offering a fresh start, even after the most difficult confrontations. The morning after the Manchester conference dawned cold and clear, but the atmosphere inside Progressive Daily's Boston headquarters was anything but serene. Sarah Chen sat in her corner office, her second cup of coffee growing cold as she reviewed the video clips flooding social media. The hashtag number #JournalismFail was trending, alongside number Leavitt class and number respect in politics. Her computer screen displayed multiple tabs: Twitter threads dissecting Barrett's behavior, opinion pieces from competing publications, and an inbox filling with letters from readers and journalism ethics organizations. The clip of Barrett calling Congresswoman Leavitt "sweetheart" during the panel had garnered over 2 million views overnight. The hallway confrontation, captured from multiple angles by conference attendees, was approaching similar numbers. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, already knowing who it would be. Michael Barrett entered, looking like he hadn't slept. His typically pristine button-down shirt was slightly wrinkled, and his usual confident stance was nowhere to be seen. In the harsh morning light, he looked older than his 58 years. "Sit down, Michael." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk. The Boston skyline stretched behind her, a stark backdrop to what she knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of her career. "Sarah, I can explain," Barrett began, but she held up her hand. "I've known you for 15 years, Michael. You've been with Progressive Daily for nearly 3 decades. Your coverage of the 2008 financial crisis won us a Pulitzer." She paused, letting the weight of his achievements hang in the air. "Which is why yesterday's behavior is not just disappointing, it's incomprehensible." She turned her monitor around, showing him the social media statistics. 2 million views, Michael. 2 million people watching one of our senior journalists engage in exactly the kind of behavior we've spent years criticizing others for. Barrett shifted in his seat. The Congresswoman is inexperienced. Someone needs to ask the hard questions. Hard questions? Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. Questioning her appearance? Calling her sweetheart and dear while addressing male panelists by their titles? That's not hard journalism, Michael. That's harassment. She pulled up another screen, this one showing emails from their major advertisers. We've lost 3 advertisers this morning. The National Association of Women in Media has issued a statement condemning our publication. The Congressional Press Association is reviewing our credentials. Barrett's face paled. I can issue an apology. It's beyond that now. Sarah stood, walking to her window. The morning sun cast long shadows across her office. This isn't just about yesterday. I've reviewed your recent articles. There's a pattern of dismissive coverage toward younger politicians, particularly women. Your piece last month about Instagram politicians was barely disguised ageism. She returned to her desk, pulling out a folder. The board met in an emergency session this morning. Given the severity of the ethical breach and the damage to our publication's credibility, they've recommended immediate termination. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Barrett's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. Sarah, please. I have my daughters to think about. Lauren's starting college next year, and Emily's medical bills. I know about your girls, Michael. I was at Emily's 16th birthday party last year. Sarah's voice softened slightly. But this isn't just about you anymore. This is about our publication's integrity, about the message we send to young journalists, about our responsibility to maintain professional standards. She slid the folder across the desk. The severance package is generous. 3-month salary, health benefits through the end of the year, and a letter of recommendation focusing on your past achievements. Though I'm legally obligated to disclose the reason for termination, if asked. Barrett stared at the folder, not touching it. Outside, a group of protesters had gathered, their signs visible from the 10th floor window. Journalism without bias and hold media accountable? 30 years, he said quietly. 30 years of building a career, gone because of one bad day. One bad day that revealed underlying biases we can't ignore, Sarah corrected gently. The world is changing, Michael. Our journalism needs to change with it. As if to emphasize her point, her phone buzzed with another news alert. A major journalism school had just announced they would be using the video clips as a case study in their ethics class. Barrett finally reached for the folder, his hands slightly shaking. What am I supposed to do now? Take some time, reflect. Maybe use this as an opportunity to examine why you reacted so strongly to a young woman in power. Sarah's tone was professional, but not unkind. The security team will escort you to clear out your desk. Your building access will be deactivated at the end of the day. As Barrett stood to leave, he looked suddenly older, diminished. The weight of 3 decades of journalism seemed to press down on his shoulders. At the door, he paused. I never thought it would end like this. Neither did I, Michael, Sarah replied. Neither did I. After he left, Sarah remained at her desk, drafting the public statement that would need to be released. Her cursor blinked over the words, commitment to unbiased journalism, when her assistant buzzed through. Ms. Chen, Congresswoman Leavitt's office is on line 1. Sarah stared at the blinking phone light, wondering what more this story could possibly hold. Outside, the protesters' signs caught the morning sun, casting scattered reflections across her office walls. the day was far from over. The news of Michael Barrett's termination reached Congresswoman Leavitt during a constituent meeting in New Hampshire. After a moment of reflection, she excused herself and made a decisive call to Progressive Daily's offices. "Ms. Chen," Leavitt began during their conversation, "while I appreciate your publication taking a stand against unprofessional behavior, I believe there might be a better way forward." She shared her own experiences of facing prejudice in politics and how those challenges had shaped her approach to leadership. Sometimes, the most powerful response to bias isn't punishment, but education and opportunity for growth. Sarah Chen listened intently as Leavitt proposed an alternative. Instead of termination, Barrett could be placed on probation, during which he would complete comprehensive sensitivity and bias training, mentor young journalists, particularly women entering the field, write a series examining ageism and gender bias in political coverage. Initially skeptical, Chen found herself moved by Leavitt's advocacy for second chances. "You of all people have the right to want him gone?" she observed. "True change doesn't come from punishment alone," Leavitt responded. "It comes from understanding and growth." 2 weeks later, Barrett began his probationary period. His first assignment was to interview young politicians across the political spectrum about their experiences with age and gender bias. The series, titled New Voices, New Perspectives, would go on to win several journalism awards. The story concluded with Barrett's letter to Leavitt. "Dear Congresswoman Leavitt, your advocacy for my second chance has taught me more about leadership than 30 years of political coverage. I was wrong, not just in my behavior, but in my assumptions. Thank you for showing me that true strength lies not in attacking others, but in lifting them up, even when they don't deserve it. Respectfully, Michael Barrett." Leavitt kept the letter as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is grace.